Christmas Eve, 1945. While most families were preparing for the happiest day of the year, the Sodder family in Fayetteville, West Virginia was about to experience a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What happened that night defies explanation, and even now, almost 80 years later, nobody knows the truth. George and Jennie Sodder had 10 children. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and that was enough. Their small home was always filled with noise, laughter, and the chaos that comes with raising such a large family. On that Christmas Eve, the children were excited. They'd stayed up later than usual, playing with toys and enjoying the magic of the holiday season. Eventually, Jennie sent them off to bed, though some of the older kids were still awake when she finally went to sleep around 1 in the morning. Just a few hours later, Jennie woke up to a sound. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, or maybe one of the kids getting up for water. But then she smelled it. Smoke. Thick, choking smoke that made her eyes water. She screamed for George, and within seconds, they realized their worst fear. The house was on fire. George ran to get the children while Jennie tried to call the fire department. But when she picked up the phone, there was no dial tone. Nothing. The line was completely dead. Panic set in as George and Jennie managed to get 4 of their children out of the house. Marion, the 17-year-old, escaped along with her younger siblings. But 5 of them, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, who ranged in age from 5 to 14, were still inside. Their rooms were upstairs, and the staircase was already engulfed in flames. George tried to go up anyway, but the heat pushed him back. The fire was spreading too fast. He ran outside, thinking he could use his ladder to reach the second-floor windows. But the ladder, which was always kept by the side of the house, was gone. It had vanished. Desperate, George tried to move his truck so he could climb on them to reach the windows. But neither of his 2 trucks would start. Both of them. On the same night. In the freezing cold, George kept trying, over and over, but the engines wouldn't turn over. By now, neighbors had noticed the fire, and some came running to help. But nobody could reach the children. The flames were too intense. Someone finally drove to the fire station to alert them since the phone wasn't working. But here's where things get even stranger. The fire department, which was only 2.5 miles away, didn't arrive for 7 hours. 7 hours. By the time they got there, the house had burned completely to the ground. All that was left was a pile of smoldering ash and twisted metal. The fire chief and police conducted a brief investigation. They ruled that the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring. They told George and Jennie that the 5 missing children had died in the fire and that their bodies had been completely incinerated. The temperature had been so high, they claimed, that nothing was left, not even bones. George and Jennie were told to accept it and move on, but they couldn't, because nothing about this made sense. George Sodder knew houses. He'd worked in construction his entire life. He knew that house fires, even intense ones, don't cremate human remains. Bones don't just disappear, and this wasn't even a particularly long or hot fire. When the ashes finally cooled enough to search through them, George hired a private investigator to help him sift through the debris. They found household items, appliances, pieces of furniture, but no human remains. Not a single bone fragment, not a tooth, nothing. Then there were all the other things that didn't add up. The phone line had been cut, not damaged by the fire, but deliberately cut. The ladder didn't just fall or get moved. It was found later, thrown down an embankment far from the house. And both of George's trucks, which had worked perfectly fine the day before, suddenly wouldn't start on the same night. When mechanics examined them later, they found that the electrical systems had been tampered with. Someone had sabotaged them. George began to remember strange things that had happened in the weeks before the fire. A man had come to the house claiming he was selling life insurance, but he spent most of his time asking odd questions and staring at the fuse box. Before he left, he made a bizarre comment, pointing at the fuses and saying they were bound to cause a fire someday. Then he looked George directly in the eyes and said, "Your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." George was an Italian immigrant, and he'd been vocal about his opinions during the war. He'd criticized Mussolini and the Italian fascist government, and he'd made enemies because of it. People in town knew about his views. Had someone targeted his family because of it? It seemed insane, but George couldn't shake the feeling that this hadn't been an accident. Then the sightings began. A woman who ran a tourist stop about 50 miles away came forward. She said that on the morning after the fire, very early, around 7 a.m., she'd seen 5 children who matched the description of the Sodder children. They were with 2 men and 2 women. The children looked terrified. They weren't talking, and they seemed scared. The woman said she tried to approach them, but the adults quickly ushered the children into a car and drove away. She didn't think much of it at the time, but when she heard about the fire, she immediately contacted the Sodders. Another man reported seeing the children in a car driving through town on Christmas morning. He said they looked disheveled and frightened. A waitress at a diner claimed she'd served a group matching that description. The children had been silent while the adults with them did all the talking. None of these people had any reason to lie. They didn't know the Sodders. They came forward on their own because something about what they'd seen bothered them. George and Jennie spent the rest of their lives searching. They put up a billboard along the highway with photographs of their 5 missing children. The sign offered a reward for any information. It stayed up for decades, a constant reminder of that terrible Christmas Eve. They hired private investigators. They followed every lead, no matter how small, but nothing ever brought them closer to the truth. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jennie received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man who looked to be in his 20s or 30s. On the back, someone had written, "Louis Sodder." Louis was one of the missing children. He would have been around that age by 1968. The photo showed a man with dark hair and features that resembled Louis. But there was something else written on the back. "I love Brother Frankie, Elil Boys, A90132 or 35. Jennie was convinced it was her son. The handwriting, the cryptic message, everything pointed to the possibility that Louis was alive and trying to send her a message. Maybe he couldn't speak freely. Maybe he was being watched. George and Jennie hired another investigator to track down where the photo had come from. The postmark indicated it had been mailed from Kentucky. The investigator said he'd look into it and asked for money up front. George and Jennie paid him, and then he disappeared. They never heard from him again. The trail went cold. George Sodder died in 1969, never knowing what happened to his children. Jennie lived until 1989, spending over 40 years searching for answers. The billboard came down, but the mystery remained. What really happened that night? Were the children taken? If so, by whom? And why? Some people believe the fire was deliberately set to cover up a kidnapping. Maybe someone with a grudge against George, for his political views, wanted to punish him in the cruelest way possible. Others think the children were taken and sold, perhaps sent to another family or even trafficked. The photograph Jennie received suggests that at least one of the children may have survived and grown up somewhere else, possibly not even knowing his real identity. The fact that no remains were ever found is the biggest piece of evidence that the children didn't die in the fire. Modern forensic experts agree that it's virtually impossible for 5 bodies to be completely incinerated in a house fire, especially one that burned for such a relatively short time. There should have been something left: bones, teeth, anything. The case has been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and countless articles over the years. It's become one of America's most enduring mysteries, right up there with cases like the disappearance of Amelia Earhart or the identity of D.B. Cooper. But unlike those cases, this one involves children. Innocent children who vanished on Christmas Eve and were never seen again. The truth is out there, somewhere. Maybe someone knows what happened. Maybe there are people still alive who were involved or who witnessed something that night. Maybe Louis, if that photograph really was him, is still out there, an old man now, with memories of a life he was stolen from. Or maybe the answer died with George and Jennie, buried alongside their grief and unanswered questions. Whatever the truth is, the Sodder children deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice. And their story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed or lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us, and they get away with the unthinkable. If you found this story as haunting as we did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true horror stories that will keep you up at night. Share this video to help keep the memory of the Sodder children alive. And if you have any information about this case, no matter how small it might seem, please reach out to the West Virginia State Police. Even after all these years, it's never too late for the truth to finally come to light. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think happened that Christmas Eve. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.